Everyone, good to see you all. I'm going to share some slides to talk you through the key part of the presentation, as Christine just mentioned. So give me a second while I get that set up. Hopefully you can all see my slides now. A couple of nods, a couple of thumbs up. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. Yeah. So effectively, we're going to spend this morning's session, this morning's workshop, giving you an overview of the findings from the research that we carried out about the economic impact of the independent museum sector this year, which informed an update of both the overarching report, but also an update of the AIM Economic Impact Toolkit. I'll talk you through the summary report findings. We'll then pause for any questions or comments on that. And John will then take you through a couple of different aspects that we have in this year's version of the toolkit. In that we have both the main toolkit document, which I'm sure you're all, or most of you will be very aware of, and John will talk you through the processes around that in terms of applying that toolkit to your museum. But we will also give you an overview about the spreadsheet version of the toolkit that we now have. Some of you may have the opportunity to have a look at that. If not, we'll talk you through it. John will give you an example of it, and we'll also have the opportunity to run a live example later on in the workshop. And as Christine mentioned, there'll be an opportunity for a Q&A towards the end as well. So if you get any questions about the toolkit, John and I will hopefully be able to answer them for you. But a little bit of background for those that don't know. The AIM Economic Impact Toolkit was originally developed in 2010, which seems a while ago now, and it has been refreshed and updated at various points since then. It was refreshed in 2014, but that was a light touch refresh to simply update the tourism and visitor metrics, because some of the toolkit is underpinned by data from elsewhere, Visit Britain, Visit England, and the respective tourism agencies for the other nations. And it was updated in 2014 to reflect changes in those tourism spend metrics. It was revised in 2019, and that was a notable update in that we expanded the toolkit to capture not only what we would call, as economists, the gross economic impacts of museums, both collectively as a sector, but individually through the toolkit, but also the net additional economic impacts, which is quite an important aspect in terms of making the case to funders and partners. And we'll come on to that later on when John talks you through the different processes for the toolkit. The change this year was very much underpinned by changes in the wider context. The economic and social context in 2024 is quite different to what it was in 2019. So it was an opportunity to update it in terms of those wider economic and social context characteristics to underpin both the research and the toolkit, but also to position the toolkit in terms of where it sits in wider supporting evidence around the economic value of museums, and where the toolkit sits within that, what a toolkit does and what the toolkit doesn't do to some extent as well. So this 2024 version has updated those relevant metrics again that we mentioned using the most up-to-date available tourism data. There are some gaps in that we're hoping will be updated soon, and as soon as that is updated from the relevant official data sources, the toolkit itself will be updated accordingly. The toolkit this year was also updated in terms of the underpinning assumptions around the different ways to assess economic impact, and that was based on the survey results from a survey of a membership that we did earlier this year. I'll give you a bit more detail about that in a minute or two. Finally, this year's refresh also considered the presentation of the toolkit, and by that we're talking about both how it's presented in the document format, but especially the spreadsheet version of the toolkit. So we'll talk about that later on this morning as well. Important to acknowledge at this point as well that, as with the previous versions, the 2010 and 2019, the toolkit relies on gathering data, and it's through a survey of AIM museum members. So for those that were able to take part or managed to respond to that survey, thank you very much, because that's a very important aspect to it. Having as good a response as possible from yourselves as AIM museum members makes the findings more robust. Talking of which, the key part of research that underpinned the update to the toolkit and to the summary report was a survey that took place earlier on spring this year, over April and May. It got a good response rate, and in fact an improved response rate compared to previous versions, more than 250 raw replies, as you might describe it, but more than 166 valid responses that we were able to include within the analysis that underpins the findings I'm about to present of the economic impact of the sector, but also the assumptions that underpin the toolkit that John will talk about later on. That 166 replies equated to 18% of AIM museum members at that point in time. And it also had a good response rate by museum size. And I'll come on to that in a second, but that's an important aspect. Museums are very, very different. And especially in terms of museum size, economic characteristics are notably different between different sizes of museums. So having a good response rate by different size bands is also an important consideration. All in all, that means we think we've got good, robust data that underpins both the advocacy headlines I'll talk about, but also the refresh of the toolkit itself. Just to reassure you on that, that's a summary version of a table that's in the main report, but it just draws the AIM membership as it was at that point and compares it to survey respondents. And if you're looking at the percentages effectively, so that you can see the difference in terms of small museums, 78% of AIM members, 75% of survey respondents. So pretty close across the board. And I've noticed the first typo, that should be 166, not 966 in that bottom row if anybody's looking at those numbers. But what it does reassure us is the survey was representative of AIM membership by size in terms of small, medium, large and largest museums. John will talk you through them in a little bit more detail later on. But overall, in terms of the approach that we take to this, we are economic researchers by background. So the approach that underpins both the analysis in the report, but also the toolkit approach, is standard best practice around economic assessments and economic impact assessments. So the toolkit sets out how an individual museum can estimate their overall, which we will call gross economic impact, as well as their net additional economic impact in their local area. So the toolkit is aimed at individual museums and using that to show the gross and net economic impact that they have in their local area. The sector report focuses more on the overall impacts, and that's therefore the gross economic impacts of the sector. It's not possible to do a net additional economic approach when we look at the whole sector collectively. I'll present, as I say, the headline results, and the approach to the summary report is very much the approach that's taken to the toolkit itself. So it will be useful for you to see this at the aggregate level as well as the individual level later on. But we look at different aspects. We look at employment, and that's paid employment, but also includes the volunteer workforce as well, which is a very important part for independent museums. It looks at procurement, that is spend on goods and services by museums. So that has an important economic contribution in terms of what museums might spend on purchasing goods and services from other businesses in the local area, as well as nationally and internationally. We look at very important strand of visitors and the impact of visitors. And within that, we look at two different strands: overall impact of visitors, both on-site at the museums, but also off-site in the local economies within which the museums are located. And we have to distinguish between that so that there's no double counting of any of the economic impacts. We can then aggregate together all of those different aspects to have the overall impacts, and as well as looking at the direct impacts of actual employment, for example, at the museum, actual spend, we also look at those knock-on impacts in the wider area, which we would call the indirect and induced impacts. I'll explain that a little bit more. The report itself, I'm not going to deal with it today, also makes some comparisons with the previous research so that we can make it clear what can and cannot be compared. But unless we deal with that in the Q&A, we won't touch on that in this morning's session, but the main report does that for anyone that's interested. On employment, first of all, the survey results told us that 61% of respondents had paid employees at their museum. By default, we're talking about 39% that therefore don't, and volunteers play a far more important part in terms of the workforce for those museums. We'll come on to that in a second. The tables that are here just give you an idea, and again, it's by the size categories, small, medium, large, and largest. And I should actually just explain them for anybody that isn't aware what they fit in. From AIM's perspective, a small museum is one with up to 20,000 visitors per year. A medium sits between 20 and 50,000 visitors a year. A large, 50 to 100, and the largest are those that have more than 100,000 visitors a year. As you'll see from these employment numbers, and it's not surprising but important to emphasise, the employment varies notably across different types of museum within these categories of small, medium, large, and largest. The information just gives you the number of responses that we had, the range of the answer to what was the overall employment number, which is the top table, and also what the full-time equivalent of that is, which is what the second table provides you with. And you can see the median values at the end, and that's what underpins the analysis that gives us the aggregated impacts for employment at this point. But you can see that the range of employment, the scale of employment varies by museum size. And in terms of assessing the economic impact, and especially the local economic impact, then the home location, the residential location of employees is an important consideration. John will explain where that sits within the toolkit later on. But overall, based on the survey results, around 70% of the jobs that were identified through the survey are located in the areas where the museums are. So that's typically in a local authority area. So that's a notable impact in terms of the number of jobs that sit within local areas where museums are located. As I mentioned earlier, the survey found that not all museums do have paid staff. 39% reported they didn't have paid employees, and therefore the role of volunteers is very important there. In terms of that volunteer contribution, the survey results tell us that we asked about the number of volunteers, number of regular volunteers that museums had, and also the number of volunteer days that they contributed each year. And if we aggregate those numbers across, across the entire AIM membership, we end up with almost 39,000 regular volunteers and more than 500,000 days of volunteering per year. So a notable contribution from volunteers. If we assume a standard working day, 7-hour working day, and apply minimum wage rates to that, then that volunteer contribution could be valued at more than £41 million. That's purely a metric if you were applying the minimum wage. That's not about the value that volunteers give to museums. That's just a way of us estimating if those volunteer contributions were paid at minimum wage rates, what that would equate to. The table at the side, should have explained, just shows you the range, which is very consistent across all museum sizes in terms of minimum and maximum, but you'll see the average mean figures vary. And what that is, that's the percentage of employees that are based in a local area. So small museums typically report a higher proportion of employees based in a local area, and that diminishes slightly as you move towards the large and largest museum types. If we take those those employment results for each of those individual museum types and aggregate it across the entire AIM membership, it equates to more than 7,200 jobs, around or almost 4,700 full-time equivalent jobs. They are a mix, obviously, of full-time, part-time, and seasonal employment. And the table just gives you a breakdown in terms of overall employment and the full-time equivalents of that employment by museum size. As I mentioned, 70% of those jobs are in the local areas where museums are based, showing there's a significant direct local employment impact from museums. And I mentioned already those volunteer values of more than 500,000 days, almost 39,000 volunteers, and a value of more than £41 million in terms of what the wage equivalent for that would be. In terms of procurement, so spend on goods and services, obviously that's another key strand of impact for independent museums. And if we take a similar approach and look at what museums say they spent in terms of goods and services from the survey respondents and apply that across the entire membership, it suggests that, or estimates that, the total procurement value was more than £131 million. So that's spent on goods and services by independent museums. Again, you can see the different ranges and the averages, the median averages by museum type. And not surprisingly, they are the larger the museum, the greater the value of procurement of other goods and services is. But that £131 million spend equates, if we use standard economic metrics to convert it, to around 2,900 full-time equivalent jobs. So once again, that procurement impact has a notable impact economically. And where it takes place economically depends on where that spend takes place. The survey findings show that almost half, 49.5%, of that procurement spending takes place in the local areas where the museums are. So almost half, give or take a small percentage point, takes place in the areas where the independent museums are located. So once again, a notable economic impact of museums on their local areas. The three tables at the side just provide the spend averages in terms of local spend, national spend, and international spend. And what that shows is, as well as that 49.5% of the spend that takes place locally, more on average, more than 48% of it takes place nationally. A small percentage is international. So again, showing both locally and nationally the contribution that independent museums make economically. So in summary, around the procurement for independent museums, more than 131 million impact, which is around 2,900 full-time equivalent jobs. And the vast majority of that takes place nationally. Almost half of it actually takes place in the local areas where museums are based. So if you're looking for advocacy messages, then there's some clear findings here that will help with that. The third strand, and a very important strand, is around visitors and the impact, the economic impact that visitors to independent museums have. The tables, just to explain them, show again the number of responses we got and the range of visitors that the different types of museums have. So the minimum and maximum, one museum, as you can see, at least one was closed under the year in which we're analysing it, hence why the minimum is reported as 0 at that point. But we get both the minimum and maximum to show the range, but also the median values that underpin the analysis. And using those median values and applying them to the entire AIM membership provides us with an estimate for 2023 of more than 19.5 million visitors to independent museums. And you can see from that breakdown where those visitors are in terms of museum type. Importantly, in terms of economic impact, we need to look at where the visitors are from as well. And these three tables show this, again, a bit like the procurement spend. It gives us it for local visitors, national visitors, and international visitors. And it shows, again, the range and the averages, the mean, in terms of percentage of visitors that are of that type. So the top table is about the percentage that are local, the middle table, the percentage of visitors that are national, and the bottom one, the percentage of visitors that are international. That gives us that breakdown, and we can again apply those metrics across the entire AIM membership to get an estimate of total visitors. That table gives you that total visitor figure of 19.5 million I mentioned, broken down both by museum type and also by type of visitor. And you can see the difference there in terms of where international visitors typically tend to visit compared to national, compared to local. An important aspect for economic impact is about the number of adult visitors that museums have. The metrics from Visit Britain and their other relevant tourism agencies provide data about adult spend, those age 16 plus. So we have to estimate the number of adult visitors to museums. The standard approach in the absence of other data is to assume a 3/4, 1/4 split. When it comes to the toolkit, if you've got bespoke data for your museum, then please use that instead. But at the national level, we assume a 75% adult, 25% child split in terms of visitors, which on that 19.5 million figure gives us 14.6 million adult visitors per year to independent museums. It's estimated based on standard spend metrics from those tourism agencies. That equates to more than £497 million worth of spend each year. And much of that spend will contribute to the local economies where museums are based. An important aspect that I mentioned earlier on is about the extent to which some of that spend will take place on site at the museums, and some of it takes place off site in the wider local economies, which again is an important advocacy strand if you're making the case to local stakeholders about the value of museums. Museums attract people to places, and people spend money in those places, not just at the museum, but also off-site in the local area. And if we take findings from the survey and we've cross-checked it with other relevant research evidence sources, we can look at the typical on-site spending at museums, and we've broken that down by size. John will cover that in the toolkit later on. But we can apply those on-site spending metrics and take that off of those total visitor spend metrics to get an off-site impact. So this is the impact of museums, not on the museum, in the museums themselves, but in the wider economies. And it gives us an off-site visitor impact for visitors of £279.2 million. So a notable off-site impact from museums. So in brief, the independent museums, based on the analysis of the survey results, attracted more than 19.5 million visitors. Around 14.6 of them were adult visitors. In terms of type, 8.9 million are local, are living in the local areas where the museums are, but that means that 10.6 million are either day or overnight or international visitors from further afield, showing the role that museums play in attracting people to places. That overall gross spend is 479 million, both on-site and off-site, but the majority of that takes place off-site, that 279 million, showing the impact that museums have in their local areas. That value can be converted into a jobs estimate based on typical economic values around turnover for museums and turnovers per employee, which suggests that that level of off-site visitor expenditure equates to around 3,800 jobs. So if we take all of that, add it all together, we can provide a gross direct economic contribution of the independent museum sector. So this is that direct employment, so it's jobs at museums, procurement spend by museums, visitor impacts off-site. We take off the on-site because we can't count that, because it would end up with us double counting, because that on-site spend helps to underpin those employment numbers and also the procurement patterns. So we look at direct jobs, direct procurement, and off-site visitor impacts. And if we add them together, it gives us 11,300 direct jobs, which is equivalent to more than £500 million of expenditure. That's direct impacts. An important aspect of economic impact is to look at the wider knock-on effects of that, what we call the indirect and induced effects from that. And we use multiplier values. That's effectively, for those that aren't aware, what we're looking at there is capturing the knock-on impacts. If a person is employed at a museum, then where they spend their wages is one of those knock-on induced impacts from the museum employment. So we've got a direct job at the museum, but if that employee spends their money in the local area, that has a wider knock-on impact. And that's what the multiplier approach seeks to capture. And if we use those multipliers, again, taken from official ONS sources, we can work out an overall gross economic impact, which captures the direct, the indirect, and the induced effects. And that is around 17,900 jobs for the independent museum sector, which can also be expressed as almost £840 million of expenditure. So that gives us an idea about the overall impacts of the sector, but a lot of the approach taken there is very similar to what you would apply in the toolkit for your own individual museum. So I'm going to pause there. Happy to take any questions if anyone has any before I pass on to John, who will take you through the toolkit. I'm not been keeping up with the chat as I've been talking. Are there any comments or questions at this point that anybody wants to contribute? I'm guessing not. That's fine. I should have overwhelmed you with too much information in too little a time, or you're more interested in how the toolkit applies to yourselves. So I will pass on to John to let him talk you through the toolkit itself, the toolkit process, give you some examples from the toolkit, and we'll also give you the chance later on to look at how you can apply the toolkit to your museum. John.
Thanks, Stephen. Hello, everybody. Now we've looked at the sector as a whole, it's time to sort of begin to understand how we might use the toolkit. Now, um, what I'm going to do this morning is go through the how the toolkit works, and how you would use it if you were to go through the toolkit process yourself and doing the maths yourself. Now, this is important because it's really important for you all to understand, the logic and the metrics that go behind this, in case you're having to answer questions for people that you're advocating to, funders, decision makers, etc., etc. But the good news is, as Stephen has mentioned, and is on the AIM website, that we've now developed a spreadsheet that does all the hard work for you. So that we're going to do a little demonstration of that in a little while as well. But to get to that wonderful position of that magnificent spreadsheet, you're going to have to suffer a little bit of the mechanics of how the toolkit works, just to make sure that you understand the detail. So since 2010, the toolkit has been used in a range of ways, but we can sort of bring them together into three groups: generating good news stories. If you're talking about the contribution of visitor impact and employment impact, over and above the fantastic work you do, it's a good way of generating a story in the press, of having something to have in that elevator conversation with a decision maker, making the case, and both positive and shoring up advocacy with decision makers. When you're in a situation where you think, well, actually, we do get a grant or some core funding from X, and using the toolkit allows you to sort of go down the route of saying, well, as well as all these audience-based outcomes and targets that we're working towards, and all this fantastic activity we deliver, there are jobs and pounds and shillings and pence in the local economy that we help generate, and we don't, it's a case of using government green book economic techniques to make the case. I always joke with Stephen that we have to make sure that this stuff passes the local authority director of finance test. And then evidence to support funding applications. Quite often we, as evaluators, see documentation that comes through projects where it's very clear to us that the economic impact toolkit has been used and used well, to add value to the range of outcomes and targets that are in funding applications. So there's a range of different uses for the toolkit. We think it's been well used over the years. I think one of the main metrics for us in that is that people keep asking us to do it again, and update it. So that's always a good thing, and it's always a topic of conversation when we bump into people in events. To be honest, it's 14 years down the road. It's been great for us too. It's been a really good way to see the sector in a range of different lights. So let's crack on. Thanks, Stephen. Right. Building on previous versions, this is a great way for you to capture your economic impact using good practice guidance. We're making it easier to use. It is AIM's toolkit, but it can be used in a range of settings. It does apply beyond independent museums. We're kind of trying to avoid using a numbers in, numbers out box approach. Although the fact we've produced a spreadsheet kind of has scuppered that a little bit, but hence the reason to understand the thinking behind it. It's a general toolkit. I think it's fair to say that larger museums, larger organisations will probably derive more benefit from commissioning their own bespoke assessment than using the toolkit. It is very much designed to support small, volunteer-run organisations. Thanks, Stephen. Right. Depending on the needs that you have, there are different levels in the toolkit. So it starts off at the gross level and goes to the net level. And obviously there's more detail for the latter. Part A is gross impact. And if you're interested really solely in overall advocacy messages, what's the visitor impact? What's the employment impact? Even what's the offsite visitor impact? Anna, thank you for your question. Yes, it can, but it is AIM's toolkit. It can be used in a range of different ways. If you're using the toolkit to help inform and influence funding and investment decisions, and you want to assess an evidence net additional impact. When we talk about net additional impact, we're talking about the impact that really would not happen without your operations. Then various aspects of Part B are more relevant. Thanks, Stephen.
Oh, no idea.
Right. The most important part of the toolkit is the numbers that you put into it. So collecting data is really important. Please make sure it's as accurate as it possibly can be, and it relates specifically to the museum using the toolkit. Where you have data that's not available, the toolkit does provide alternatives and options, and particularly look at tables 1 and 2 in the back of the toolkit. And that's a breakdown of the different size approaches that AIM uses for different museum sizes. Thank you, Stephen. So Part A, we're looking at gross economic impact of a museum, and we're looking at overall and off-site visitor impacts. We're looking at overall employment impacts. If you employ people, then it's really important to capture and express the impact of your employees, and looking at spend of goods and services as well. So this is looking at seeing how the money you spend on stuff in the local economy circulates and provides extra impact. So the overall gross impact is adding those three things together. To establish visitor impacts, you need to be looking at the last complete year, and you need to have an adult-child split. Understanding the proportion of your adult visitors that are local, day visit and overnight is important. Some museums will have data for this. If you don't have data, it's fine to rely on your judgment. When you're spending a lot of time on the front desk, you'll be talking to people. You'll have a good sense of how those splits break down. But if you do have that information, it's better to use it. You could be using it from museum-specific surveys, or perhaps till-based or museum-specific gift aid data. The next step is to select the area in which you're located from Table 1 in the toolkit, and this is a bit of a mixed bag. Roger, we'll come on to that question in a minute because it is important, but we'll cover it. In England and in England, you have county level geography. In some of the nation regions, it's a bit more mixed. So you've got options to use in Table 1 of the toolkit. But select your geography, and then really calculating the gross impact of visitors to the museum. You multiply the number of local visitors, adult local visitors, by the relevant metrics in Table 1. So it gives you a local visitor column, a day visitor, and an overnight visitor. And summing up these three values will provide the overall gross economic impact of visitors to the museum. Now, Roger Shelley from Christchurch Tramway Museum very helpfully asked the question about differentiating between those that pay and those that don't pay. And that's a really interesting area of work, of which there's another fantastic research study that Stephen and I completed recently on the AIM website with a success guide. Stephen, can we move on to the offsite slide, please? Right. When we're looking at pay and not pay, any income from entries, we need to make sure we don't double count that really. To account for that, we make sure we can distinguish between on-site and off-site visitor impacts. So adjusting for the total value of visitor spend that takes place within the museum on admissions, retail spend, catering spend. And that value is specific to each individual museum, and the best option is to try and make sure you've got that covered yourself. You can use visitor surveys or other metrics to understand what your average spend per visitor is in the shop and the cafe, and of course you'll know your average admissions as well if you charge. Adding these spend values together and multiplying by the total number of visitors per annum, and then subtract that from your level 1 impacts will provide you an off-site visitor impact. And basically, what you do then is simply count that, because the on-site spend will be included in employment costs and spends on goods and services. If you don't know the average spend figures, as a rough guide, deduct the overall annual income for the museum from the total overall visitor impacts. Or you could use a proxy measure from our own survey, the average on-site spend per visitor results from the survey. So there's a number of different ways you can look at that. But in the main, there's usually greater impact off-site than there is on-site. People spend on other things in the local economy, and you can, if your museum is driving that visitor day, then really you've got claim to all that other impact that's generated in the local economy as well. So making sure that you deal with off-site impacts. Okay, let's move on. Employment is really important as well. If you can identify the total number of employees from the last complete year, if it's changed, take an average. Establish the number of full-time equivalent employees from the last complete year. If you don't know a full-time your own full-time equivalent breakdown, you can assume that each full-time employee is one full-time equivalent, that two part-time employees equals one full-time equivalent as well. And as a rule of thumb, Stephen and I tend to apply a 5-to-1 ratio for casual employment as well. Then determine the proportion of these full-time equivalent employees that don't live locally. And we tend to use local authority area as a proxy for that, and subtract that from the total. And if you multiply that number by the magic number of 25,967, which is a GVA, gross value added figure that we've taken from national data sets, it gives you an overall, it's turnover, not GVA, it's a turnover figure. And that's the average turnover that an employee in the sector is expected to generate using official data. It gives you a pounds, shillings, and pence estimate of your overall employment effects. If you want to know the details of where that number comes from, it's in the report. The spend on goods and services is pretty straightforward, pretty much the same as employment. You understand the amount you spend on goods and services, excluding any spend related to employment from the last complete year. Determine the proportion of this which is not based locally, and subtract that from the total. And then that gives you your spend on goods and services impacts. Next, please, Stephen. Okay. And then to get the overall gross economic impact of the museum, you really just have to add together those three things: off-site impacts, employment impacts, and the impacts of spend on goods and services. Great. Part B is to take this a step further and move towards a net position. And this is where we account for things like dead weight and displacement and multiplier effects to make sure we're truly trying to isolate that impact that wouldn't have happened without the museum's operations. So it's net additional visitor impacts, it's net employment impacts, and it's net impacts of spend on goods and services. And we get each one of those three right, and then we can add them together. So with each of these three factors, we're starting off with the impacts calculated from part A. So you've done a lot of the work already. And then it's a case of factoring in the average dwell time of visitors to assess how much the visit can be attributed to your museum. If you don't have dwell time data, perhaps 1/2 day, unless you have specific quantitative evidence otherwise. If the dwell time is more than 3 hours, then really we always say that's a full day, because by the time you've done that, you've travelled, you've perhaps had lunch, that's really a full day for most folk. Using table 2, you then decide on the most appropriate displacement ratio assumption for visitors. And that gives you a range of different options that allows you to match the circumstances of your museum and select the appropriate ratio. You then need to look at a formula that takes into account attribution, dwell time, displacement, dead weight, and multiplier factors. There's a little equation there that until this year, we used to actually make users of the toolkit work out themselves. And we actually, most people found that no problem at all. But that's the magic formula that we use to give us a net impact. And summing the values for day trippers, overnight visitors together, and using the formula above, will provide the net additional economic impact of visitors to the museum. Great, thanks, Stephen. Additional employment impacts. Again, we start from part A. we selected a relevant deadweight assumption from table 2. We confirm the proportion of full-time equivalent employees that don't live locally. So making sure that we've got the right leakage ratio. The model basically assumes that people spend their wages, their income in their local area. Ideally, we'd like you to calculate that leakage from your own employment data. If you employ people, you should know where people are domiciled. But there are relevant employment leakage ratios in table 2 that you can use. Again, pick up a displacement ratio from the table, making sure it's relevant to your museum. There's the magic equation. And you apply the total number of full-time equivalent staff, taking into account deadweight, leakage, displacement, and multiplier factors. Right. Thanks, Stephen. Right, and then goods and services, it's pretty much the same thing. You're taking part A, information that you've generated already. You're selecting the relevant deadweight assumption from table 2. You make sure you understand the proportion spend on goods and services with suppliers that are not based locally. For example, if that's 50%, it gives you a spend leakage ratio of 0.5. Again, the point about using museum-specific information is there, but there are options in table 2. Select a displacement ratio, which is, again, most relevant to your museum. That's the magic equation. And then you apply it to give yourself a net spend of goods and services. And again, once you've done that, you've done all the hard work, you can just add it all together, and there you have your numbers. So that's part A and part B of the toolkit. Now that you all fully understand the logic behind it, you can go to use the spreadsheet, being very confident that you understand the economics. Thanks, Stephen. Right, now here's a photo capture of the spreadsheet. Now, those of you that know South Leicestershire well will know that Harbour Bike Museum doesn't actually exist. But my creative brain was the best that I could come up with to give an example. So that's the name of this hypothetical museum. It's based in Leicestershire, so I've selected that from a drop-down box. And in terms of how important the museum is to the overall visitor economy in the local area, I've assumed it primarily serves a local audience. In terms of visitor data, I've put in 1,000 visitors in the last full year. A modest operation, as you can tell. The number of adults were 900. 50% of these visitors were local, 45% were national, and 5% were international. I've estimated that on-site spend is £1, and people spent a very, well, not quite plausible 50% of their day at the bike museum. The museum has a wonderful concept where we lend bikes out as long as they come back in one piece and fully cleaned and polished. The museum has one employee. That employee is full-time and lives local. It spent £2,000 on goods and services last year, and 50% of that spend was local. And as you can see at the bottom, the toolkit has made sure that each one of those metrics that I have entered on behalf of this hypothetical museum fit the parameters of what we're looking for. So it's not going to cause the spreadsheet any problems. Okay, moving on. Hitting that button gives us some gross economic impact. Visitor impacts on-site and off-site are just over £30,000. Drops slightly for off-site because it's fairly low on-site spend. There's one job. So that turnover value is that magic number we saw earlier on. There's procurement impacts of £2,000. So adding those all together gives us £57,000, 710 pence. Whopping impact. Wonderful. Looking at the net impact on the next page. Oh, on the same page. Obviously, there's quite a lot netted off there because a lot of the impact is local. Etc., etc. But it still gives us a net economic impact of £24,150. And it says at the bottom, based on information provided by Jonathan Durnin on the following date. Okay, moving on. And then the spreadsheet automatically gives you some key advocacy messages: the total number of visitors to the museum, where they were from, spend of these visitors, how many staff, goods and services, the annual gross and the annual net economic impact. So there we go. So nice and simple and straightforward. Now, one of the real pleasures of doing the survey early on this year is we did ask people that filled in the survey, and thanks for all of you that did, to tell us a little bit about how the survey has helped, where they've used it, how it's made the case. And Matt's just asked a very good question about county level data for Wales. I'll come back to that in a minute, Matt, at the end. We've got some really nice statements about the previous versions of the toolkit. During my career, I've consistently used the tool to evidence the economic impact of many cultural and historic sites. Invaluable advocacy at a political level, showing the importance and the impact of the museum. Thanks, Stephen. There's some good examples of success in terms of influence and securing funding, including those examples that Stephen and I have seen when we've been evaluators, and we've seen evidence and advocacy come through in funding applications, and celebrating and advocating by publicising economic benefits to a range of internal and external audiences. My absolute favourite feedback from the survey was this one, coming up next. Hurrah! Love that it's out there again. Given Birmingham and elsewhere's threat to arts and heritage, this has really helped people make the case. Anyone that puts hurrah in a survey, absolutely spot on. Right, good. It's time for questions. I think the first question just popped up in the chat a minute ago about county level data for Wales, and that was asked by Matt